This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And I'm going to repeat some of the things I said last week because I was pleased to go to a natural area study meeting. It was a field trip to a small Sangamon River forest preserve site adjacent to the flooded Sangamon River. The trail went along the banks of the river, didn't cross the river. You had to come back. I reported that the Natural Area Study Group is a docent group, a docent group being a group that educates itself about certain things, whether it be music or a museum or natural areas in this case. And then they take their interest and excitement and knowledge to friends and relatives and to groups, might be forest reserves or schools. But I found it to be very interesting and exciting, and there were people there who all with cameras, many with knowledge, some new members. And I wanted to say a little more because there was an iconic orchid, and it wasn't flowering yet. But some people have been back to visit the orchid. They had to wait about 4 days, and then it will flower for about 2 weeks. And I'm sure quite a few people will be back to that woodlot to see that orchid flowering. It's a rarity in this part of the universe. A little bit more about the Natural Area Study Group, because some of you might like to share with others or to actually join. Some of the more interesting sites they have been to in the last little while was one site to bluebells, an acre of bluebells. If you have never seen an acre of bluebells, it's like the trees all coming out of the ocean. You just only have to use your imagination a little bit, and you'll get inspired. It snowed, and a freak snowstorm on the day, so it was postponed, which indicates that this group is fairly flexible. It is knowledgeable, excited, interested, and they meet at 9 o'clock on Tuesdays at the Anita Purvis Center parking lot. And there they decide whether they want to share vehicles so that not everyone runs a distance. They bring picnic food. That depends a little bit on having a picnic table or a place to sit down. Sometimes it's better to go to the nearby community, and so then you go to a restaurant and you don't eat your own picnic food, but you form a group of friends that chatter away, and I rather enjoy that sort of sociality. So this group is flexible. If it rains, they cancel. This Tuesday they were going to go to the Lake of the Woods, Buffalo Trace, and it rained and it would have been very soggy, not very helpful. And you don't want to impose upon people a storyline when they're standing in water or uh, attacked by elephant-sized mosquitoes or what have you. We used to do field trips with Art Institute students, and the attention span was not great when you had a lot of mosquitoes. So we moved north to the 5 states north of here. But the membership runs to about 50. It used to be a university-oriented and so mostly students, but Anne Fireham developed it and took it to the Park District, and its clientele is largely women who are at home or retirees, male and female, and but most working people don't get to use it that much because it is time consuming. A good field trip may take at least a half day, and then picnicking on top of that. But the interesting thing is that these field trips inspire species lists and visuals. So the manufacturer that often has jobs and also younger women get to share. And this week, Melissa Records had been taking photographs at that field trip, and she had gone back and taken photographs 4 days later, where there was a pudgy fruit orchid, which has leaves on it during the winter, and its fruiting bodies come out in the spring. And she's taken some remarkable photographs and shared them. So that's another formal field trip. A few weeks ago, Beth Chato led a group to Heron Pond. It's a pond north of Danville, and it has a lot of wetlands, and so the photographs from that field trip are coming through, and the species list of what birds did you see is quite long and exciting. So other times they have been nearing virus time. They've been doing short field trips to places like the Japan House and to nearby natural areas that are owned locally, but are quite interesting. There were new people. I'm sure they were impressed by are always impressed by these sorts of field trips. They can't always go. So out of those 50 people, some people are at home and can't go physically. But there's a report on the physicality of the site, how far would you have to walk and how awkward and how wet and so forth. And there's an idea of what you will see. And there's essentially a map. Now, these days you have geographic information services, and that's kind of helpful. But when you get to be near a river, the northwest, southeast, west plat that is usual in the flatlands gets disturbed, and you have to waggle around, and you can get lost. So a good map is helpful, and a lot of conversation back and forth with emails, for people who have different ways of getting to the same destination, and it's kind of fun. And it's the sort of thing that you could well join. And there are occasions when it might be not be on Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock. A group of you might decide to go out on Saturday and repeat a field trip that had been successful. For instance, it's warbler time. So do you want to go to Warbler Woods, or do you want to watch the warblers in Busey Woods? If you don't catch it on the Natural Area Study Group, you can catch it at other times. The study group comes with a lot of people with a lot of different backgrounds and interests, and it's interesting to be there and to share those interests and excitements. What else can I tell you? Oh, I think you need to know how to get hold of the Natural Area Study Group. Karen Falk has puts together a list of the scheduled field trips for the season, and she also coordinates the membership list. This is not a really formal membership. This is a convenience so you can get to each other. Sometimes with people who don't have email will enjoy the neighbor who does have. So some people are designated as relay people who will contact a few other people that they know don't operate with text messaging or email. It's becoming fewer because people do take on some of the technology. It's not that big a deal. But there's probably a few carpool, and that's part of the reason for meeting at the Need a Purpose Center, is to figure out whether they can carpool and save some gas and contribute to the universe. I would suspect that a lot of these people are tacit preservation people. We need them. We need them to know what is there. We need them to know how to go about preserving sites so that they are not wooded or destroyed in any way. We have very few of them. And so go to Anita Purpose Center and they'll give you details. It's not much point in me giving you email addresses at this point, but Anita Purpose can help you out and give you details. There are repercussions. Not only do people go back to the sites and take other people to the sites, but they also bring their cell phones and the single lens reflex cameras and report. So part of this is a pre-field trip, then a field trip, then a post-field trip where information is disseminated. Let me see what else I can tell you about the Natural Area Study Group. It has lasted for 35 years and it's done an excellent job. And some of the people who've come here from different places actually have learned about the local ecosystem from the study group. They're interested in rivers, they're interested in morainic details where the moraines were left by retreating glaciers. They're interested in the vegetation that's on various aspects there. And some of the vegetation is micro vegetation, 2 inches difference in the soil profile might mean a different species of plants. So knowing the dynamics is helpful. It might lead to volunteerism, and involvement with different groups, and so I suspect that quite a few of the Natural Area Study Group people have their feet in Audubon Society, Sierra Club, and Native Plant Society, zoological societies. And this is just one way of picking up information. Sometimes it'll direct people to the Natural History Survey, which is now part of the university, and it's a Prairie Institute. But there are people there who are specialists in what the Natural Area Study Group might be looking at. They don't usually invite in experts. This is not a very formal thing. This is more discovery. But if there are people around that do provide some information and it's known, then they will be invited in or to join the crowd as often as learners too. We're all learning together. I'm just thinking what else I should tell you, but I really want to promote the Natural Area Study Group and what they do. I was there for a slightly different reason. I'm very interested in what they're doing, but they were at a natural area in Piatt County, and Heartland Pathways, which I CEO, is very near, and it's a place where there's a number of different spots of land which are almost connected. There are spots along the Sangamon River from Decatur to Allerton Park to Monticello to Lodge Park to Mansfield and on to Springfield. It's at the other direction. There are little plots of land here and there. There are also railroad lines that have been abandoned. And these spots, amazingly enough, allow birds and bees and butterflies to hop from place to place. Sometimes you would hope that some of these places would coalesce as a slightly bigger natural area. Allerton Park is a big natural area. Lodge Park is a fairly big area. Shady Rest is not as big. It's 30 acres, but it's big enough to house a lot of creatures, and it has bottomlands next to the Sangamon and uplands that are part of the Cerro Gordo moraine. My concern is for the regional planning of these facilities so that we do connect and communicate, often just by roadside or railroad abandonment. And I took a map which shows some of these connections. It's not always very friendly to give out a map when people have to put it in their pocket and do a field trip. But on the other hand, it allows people to know a little bit more about what we do in a regional manner. In this case, they were fairly near to a railroad bed that's been abandoned between Bloomington and Mansfield. It goes through Farmer City, probably about 30 miles long, and it's wide, and the soil on either side of the ballast is still original soil if it hasn't been invaded by farmland, but often it is intact, and there's millions of bacteria and fungi and other creatures in that soil, and we have so little of it left because all our soils have been chemicalized in order to grow farmland plants. So we jealously look at the soils, and we also jealously look at the few prairie plants that find their way on the railroad right away. There is usually a road next door, and that road gets widened into the railroad bed, so you lose some sight there. But it's worth knowing about that. So some people in this group to the Sangamon Forest Preserve plot knew where that line was, and they have to know how the connection might be from Mansfield to Hickory Hill subdivision on the banks of the Sangamon, through Lickskillet, a little town that was established with the anticipation that a railroad could go through, but it didn't go through. And the name comes from early settlers, where if you had some special food, you would lick the skillet. You would go behind the door and lick the skillet clean. So once we were leaving the area on the Sangamon, we had to go south to Monticello for a recreation, a visit to a restaurant, or some people would have to leave. But some people came to the Shady Rest to see what Shady Rest was. Shady Rest is 30 acres. And when railroads came through in the 1860s, they went straight through the middle of the Shady Rest. And our Heartland Pathways railroad line goes down there. And I seriously hope that someday an extension of the Monticello Railroad Museum may go down there and invite people to have a novel trip to a Chautauqua established along the lines of when you had horses that could only go 15 miles to Shady Rest from Champaign or Decatur or wherever. That line could continue up the hill to Lodge, where it meets an active line going north and south. But if that active line were to close out, then it could be a resumption of that bed, so that the Railroad Museum could take a 23-mile trip around down to Monticello and back to Nelson's Crossing, which is the headquarters of the Railroad Museum. That's a dream at the moment. It's not likely to happen quickly, because it takes 2,000 ties to make a railroad bed. We don't have that sort of tree forest to harvest like the Amazon and put in trees. We have groups that are putting together plastic and concrete ties that can be made with gravel and plastic and polymers that come from the towers where materials are being burned that have silicates in them. And those silicates can make plastics. And we haven't quite got there yet, but there is the day when railroad builders or rebuilders will be able to put down a pattern and pour a tie and have a place for bolts and tie downs. And plastic actually moves. We hate to do too much with plastic because the world is full of plastic, but this is a use, and we don't have the renewable forests, and they're having problems too. They're getting fired every so often just because people didn't want to have lightning strikes and fires and did their best to stop. But litter accumulates, so uh, we may in time have some wooden ties. If you have lightweight rail, you can spread the ties out a little bit, so that saves you some room there. But remember that if you have a steam engine and you're wanting to bring a steam engine in from Whiteheath to Champagne, it has a very heavy drive wheels, and they're much heavier than the modern diesel machine that has 2 or 3 bogies, and the bogies spread the weight, and you, instead of putting all the energy into one machine, you can spread it at 2 or 3 machines, sometimes one in the middle of the train or one at the end of the train. So we're dreaming and wanting to leave skeletons for the future. And I was surprised on just yesterday, somebody called me, and it was from a group of people who have been working for about best part of a year and a half or more to put in a wind farm. And they've eventually got permission to do that in Piatt County. It'll probably be on a higher spot on the Cerro Gordo Moraine, which is a little higher than the surrounding flatlands. So the call was to say that Heartland Pathways looks like they might have some interest in working with the electricity group. And so I was able to remind the person that there are many different sites in and around Monticello and in and around other counties. DeWitt County, for instance, has Clinton Lake and Weldon Spring State Park, and 5 miles of Heartland Pathways railbed could join those 2 parks. And so there's a tacit look for how this energy company can work with the local community, because it doesn't always get positive feedback. Some people are afraid that the swinging fans that are on top that pick up the wind that can be going 70 miles an hour make a sound, and does that affect your brain and your heart? And so there's been lots of arguments about how close can these wind vanes be to the road, and will there be weeds growing around them? How responsible is the engineering of the dynamo that is picking up the movement and created it into electricity? So there are lots of questions, and I think some public relations could be helpful. So they're looking to see if there's a little pot of land or something that they could help with. And I'd say, Gusto, yes, we have opportunities by the zillion, and they're sitting there waiting for action. And I'm assuming that he will be going to other groups like the Grand Prairie Friends or the Piatt County Forest Preserve or Allerton Park to see what they might be able to do. I would like him to think beautiful thoughts about regional planning and how they might fit into the regional plan. And what is their story, and how will that be interpreted, and who will own what? Is this Ameren? No, it's not. Is this likely to be sold? Yes, it might be sold actually to Facebook or some other organization like that. What will it do to birds? Do birds understand the propellers that are there, the wind vanes? Actually, the birds suffer some from power lines and telephone lines that are above ground, and there is another question, because sometimes even just one wire can affect animals. So that was, to me, an occasion for me to get my head together and try and create a document that might be in the file cabinet, that would relate to other people and other agencies. Bruce Hannon has a land trust, for instance, and how can you work together? Last week we were talking to Jason Liggett, who is in charge of the Urbana Public Television, and we were talking about how to talk to each other. It's not easy, but talking to each other elicits quite a few pieces of information. You might, if you're talking to someone like myself who grew up in the boondocks, there may be a hesitancy. So you don't learn about this until you develop some sort of responsibility and understanding with the person you're talking to. You may be regarded as a wasting land because you have this weed-like material with trees and plants that are known to be weeds, because even the prairie plants were weeds, warts, curses, and they had to get rid of them before they could do agriculture. So there's a lot of skepticism out there, and it doesn't hurt to talk, even if you have to have a little hesitancy here and there, because people who are thinking about going back have to think a little bit, and sometimes you have to think about what they're talking about. I grew up with farmers who spoke very slowly, but in the long run, you learned an awful lot from those farmers. You shook hands with them, and their hands were rough. They'd been handling plows and horses and digging potatoes and milking cows and taking cream to the roadside to make butter out of it. It had to be taken by truck to a butter factory. These people were loaded with information. Their background may have been just what you have in a biblical era, when none of these people went to school. There were no schools. So grandma or mother or father would gather up the family, and usually it was huge, and in the lounge room, and they learned moral codes from the Bible, and they learned their English language, and they learned about the landscape from their own discovery or working with people who had that experience. And every conservation conference that I've gone to always emphasizes how to learn from people by way of speaking. I went to the farmers market last week, and I talked to just people, four, I think, I forget. But the first person was an organizer, Susan Smith, and she is in the sort of very near to Champaign County and on the Little Vermilion River. And there's a potential bulldog mine there. And we're not really excited by mines and at this time, and coal and carbon, and why are we putting in a new mine? And so lots of questions, and she's been in the thick of this, and an urban person who became a farm wife and mother, and so she is the sort of person that you want on your board, but everyone else wants on the board too. We need more people like that. And the Natural Area Study Group and the Audubon and the Cicada Club and Plant Society and Land Trust and CCDC and all those organizations are doing their damnedest to bring people together. And so the first person that I encountered, we need more of them. And how do we get them? Often we get them because they have curiosity. They want to know how the world works, how that blade of grass stays around. And we're down to 0.01% of the prairie. How does it survive? How does it find a nook and a cranny and it's called a niche for itself to grow, to have its roots penetrate to a certain degree of moisture, to be able to put up with the wind and Krumholtz was calling, when there's a wind regularly in one direction, the plant will bend and bow to the wind, but it'll still be alive. You have to know these things. And people who have grown up educating themselves are often loaded with this sort of information. They don't exactly tell you unless they find that you're interested. And sometimes whole families miss out on this sort of information because it's sort of private in a public that's gone very formal and very simplistic. So you have agriculture that is monoculture. It's corn and soybeans, and if you're lucky, a little bit of wheat and perhaps a few vegetables someplace, and maybe even have oats, but oats went out with the horses. The horses used to like oats, and they used to need oats. So some of the pastures have gone, and the cattle have gone. Cattle are not as profitable as agricultural farming with row crops. And besides, cattle are getting a bad name for producing methane and other gases that they expunge when they're eating material that we can't eat, but we can eat them. So there are part of a pyramid of each one, and the bottom of the pyramid may not necessarily be the lowest on the totem pole. In virus time, you realize that they can really be on top of the totem pole. So we have very different ways of expressing the interaction between plants and animals, and humans are an animal, and we have to decide whether we want to be very independent and walk the Appalachian Trail by ourselves, or do we want to belong to a group where we can actually bring back pictures from the Appalachian Trail and with excitement teach others. Not everyone wants to be a teacher, so That means we have to have media. And not everyone is going to go and walk the Appalachian Trail, and nor are they going to go 18 miles to a prairie uh, uh, by themselves and not understand it because it looks like weeds. So media becomes tremendously helpful. And we wonder how we can keep that going. We take our radio program and put pictures into it, but it requires a knowledge of a Vegas computer program to convert a radio program, drop pictures into it, and make it into a video program, so it goes up on Channel 6 twice a week, and then goes up on YouTube. So if someone from the wind energy group comes to ask, we can send them to the YouTube to find out what we do, and they know. Other people are much more prone to lead. Then you have to make sure that those leaders know what they're talking about. May not always be the case. I watch little plots of land that are put together with prairie plants. In one case, Culver's root. If you're planting the plant, it's an expensive plant. And if you're going to plant it from seed, it's going to take you a greenhouse and a lot of time and energy to get it underway. So there was this wonderful plot at Scott Park, which was all Culver's root. And I think it was a sort of statement to say that behind it, the boneyard was released from its detention pond and ran through Scott Park. So I thought it was a wonderful entree. This plant has a candelabra type inflorescence, and it's just elegance. And it probably was named Culver's root because people go looking for biochemicals in these sorts of plants, and we need to preserve them for a disease we might not know about. Or like the present virus, we don't know what chemical might help to control that virus. So we don't need to lose our vegetation, but if people don't know, then often a native vegetation can be mown to death, or it can be replaced by beautiful flowers. I have this last week the photograph Veronica. Is it Veronica? It is a whole wall of flowers and aroma, and it's an artificial flower and so much more attractive than the simple orchid that we're looking at in a different setting. This is an expanse of flowers. Sometimes I go to a shopping center and the plants outside are all yellow. You don't even see a green leaf because they've been bred to be showy. But I think we have to teach our children and our adults too that there is a value in keeping your natural history alive and afloat. I encountered someone at the detention pond last night who was asking me, was a prairie more important than a person with spirituality? And I didn't continue the discussion because I think both are valuable, but if we let our natural history go, we can never enjoy its scientific base. We won't know how the chemicals that we might use are associated with other chemicals, how they might go into the roots of plants and communicate with another plant or a tree down the road, how they balance with each other. We just don't know enough ourselves to be destroying the resource before we've even found out about it. Now, 1/3 of the birds are already gone. If we last a little while longer, if we're lucky and we don't exterminate it, then we need to keep those natural areas afloat and connectivity. The world has only so much tin and so much copper and so much coal, and we've eaten up most of it. And surprisingly enough, gravel is getting to be in short supply. So there's sulfur and there is gold, and we have extended our families. We've gotten into religious fights and colonial discussions and takeover of native places, and the efficiency of having thousands of acres in cultivation so that you can cultivate them with huge pieces of equipment. But somewhere we need those little villages that have their own rural sociology, and they have plants that we have exterminated. They're the ones that keep and they know their medicines too. And some of our biochemists go chasing those people because they've been here for such a long time that if the plant they use as a chemical is going to cause a problem, then it's obviously caused a problem with people many years ago. And so from word of mouth, that particular plant is cherished perhaps for a minute amount of its biochemical, but not too much, because too much will be a poison. The venom from a snake in very minor amounts might be almost essential for your brain, but a full dose of venom from a poisonous snake would be deadly. So we don't know enough. We need people who are curious, who are wanting to settle on little things that they wonder about. It starts off with the natural areas. So when I went around the farmers market, the next person I talked to was from a farming situation on one of the roads that intersects with the old Big Four Railroad. They're just a mile and a half down there, and they're in town, but they're going out to their farm property and farming and selling goods. So we had a conversation, and I enjoyed that, and I think they enjoyed it too. I asked the people who have mainly vegetables to sell, do they have flowers too? No, this was mainly vegetables. Where did you come from? Oh, it might have been Vermilion County. It might have been from Shabance, which is way up north. And they're prepared to come and sell it at the Urbana Farmers Market. So there are people with floral arrangements that they had grown a little further south of here, and Villa Grove, and even further south, and just chatting for a little while is helpful. And there's Carrie selling her fruit. She has access to farmland in southern Illinois, And this year it's different because there were frosts in southern Illinois at the time when plants had started to flower. So you have problems with your peaches and cherries and pears and apples. Even the zucchinis are prone to environmental situations. They had a box of zucchinis that weren't developed on one end, and it was the lack of pollination. Perhaps a cold spell had arrived and prevented the pollination. So half the zucchini seemed to be pollinated, but not the other end. I don't know quite the mechanism, but there was a whole box of these. So very carefully, you have to know your agriculture and know your soils and know if you have a sandy soil, it won't retain as much fertilizer as if you have a rich loamy soil. So please don't let excess fertilizer run off your sandy soil into the river and down the Mississippi to create a hypoxia or a dead zone in the Gulf. We keep learning. Every time we learn, there's usually some alternative that won't work, and that gets a lot of publicity, but we have to keep trying because it's the positives are worth more than the negatives. The negatives always get more publicity than the positives. So you have to think about these little bits and pieces and chat with each other and share with each other. And we miss the restaurants and we miss the bars that have had to be closed. But we also have to know the science. And we applaud the scientists who are trying to not just solve the problem of the present virus, but to look at the world and how will we be in 50 years' time and what creature will we have to live with. Animals live off of each other, and bacteria and fungi also live off humans. We're not void of animal interaction. So just taking your children to a natural area and being aware of it is very helpful. I have to say that today is the 22nd and the city has a recycling event at Parkland College, which recycles TV sets and computers that can't be recycled any other way. And it's probably almost over now, but it's a way of looking at technology. We find a new technology, it takes out all the television sets, and the technology really doesn't pick up all the old television sets. It goes on with the positive, but there's a negative. And so how can we work with that? I think it's good that we have to think about plastics. Tremendously helpful. I look at a lineup at the farmer's market with 10 plastic 8-foot tables, and those tables can be lifted by one person. If they were all wood, you would have a hard time lifting them. You would have a hard time transporting them. So their plastic is wonderful. But when I go to the grocery store and I get to take my personal bag, and I get to get given a plastic bag, it's helpful, but it's also an infringement on the environment. So please take your gunny sack and put your own food in there. Don't get 10 bags of plastic that have to be digested and, and reused. So I think we're getting time. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM trial.